Today, it's my privilege to introduce Dr. Cayne Layton, who's a research fellow and lecturer at the University of Tasmania. Cayne completed his PhD in 2018 at the University of Tasmania, and his PhD focused on resilience and stability of Cayne kelp forests. Cayne is a prolific ecology researcher, an expert scientific diver, and is a member of multiple groups engaged in science, in education, and policy. He's also an active science communicator, which is awesome, and I'm very grateful for that because it's an honor to have him participate in our kelp culture seminar series. So without further ado, Cayne, thank you very much for being here, and the floor is all yours.
Excellent. I'll just share my screen. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Stephen. Awesome. I trust everyone can see that. Just do some rearranging of my Zoom bits. So thank you very much for the invite. I mean, I'm really happy to be able to speak, I guess, across oceans and time zones and into the past, and for you to listen to some work that's happening in the future, I guess. But more just to share a little bit about some of the work that we're doing here in Tasmania. It's definitely not just me. I mean, there's a whole team of people involved, but something that I'm particularly passionate about is our Great Southern Reef, which I'll talk more about, but that's something that I really find a lot of enjoyment in communicating and discussing, because it's quite unknown and kind of surprising and special to a lot of people. And I apologize, I'm on the tail end of a cold too, so my voice gets a bit croaky and I stop for a drink. You'll understand why. So I'm often, put this at the end of my presentation, but I really I've recently been moving them more to the front, and I just wanted to acknowledge all the diverse kind of partners and supporters of this work. And especially I wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands and waters on which this work was conducted and on which I live, and pay the respects of my team to elders past and present. A lot of the connections and the work that we do with Indigenous Tasmanian communities and Indigenous Australian communities more broadly on the mainland is a really kind of core part of our work, and something that's very near and dear to a lot of the team here. And one of our restoration sites that I'll talk more about later on is in partnership with the Weetapuna Aboriginal Corporation, which is a local Indigenous Tasmanian community. And they actually selected the restoration site for us. They heard about our work. They heard that we were potentially looking for experimental sites where we could do some of these trials, and they put their hand up, and that's been a really kind of encouraging, really wonderful relationship so far, and is, in a way, we're kind of cultivating that relationship to extend beyond the time frame of scientific funding. They're very aware, and they're very thankful to have engagement with scientists, but they're very aware that we work on often a 1 or 2 or 3 year project time span. It's very funding dependent, and they've been very generous, kind of sharing a lot of their knowledge with us that in many ways spans back hundreds, thousands of years, a deep cultural knowledge of these sites. And so we wanted to kind of make sure that we could leave them with some lasting impact. And so what we've agreed to do, and as kind of a way to repay that generosity and that knowledge that they shared with us, is to share our knowledge back to them. So once we really kind of start to nail down our kelp restoration methods, we're actually going to train up members of the community to both grow their own kelp in the hatchery or the lab, which is an important part of restoration, and then how to plant it and to restore their own reef, so they can autonomously, I guess, go and just look after their own sea country without having to be partnership with a scientific organization, and it gives them a lot more freedom. So yeah, just wanted to acknowledge that straight up front, and I can talk more about that at the end for anyone that's interested. So a lot of people will have heard of the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, this spectacular tropical reef system dominated by corals, but we also have this amazing temperate or cold water reef system in southern Australia called the Great Southern Reef. And it's a rocky reef system, so the rocks of the coastline and the islands and the headlands, they really provide that complexity, that structure that creates the reef. But the real secret of the Great Southern Reef is that it's dominated by seaweeds, but especially kelp. And that creates all of that lush environment and these really kind of verdant, super hyper productive and hyper diverse underwater forests. Just like the Great Barrier Reef, the Great Southern Reef is formed from thousands of interconnected reefs, both biologically and physically linked. It's actually 4 times as long as the Great Barrier Reef. So about 8,000 kilometers, which I think is probably about 5,500 miles. You can see it stretches across the entire southern coastline of our continent, right from, relatively high kind of subtropical latitudes all the way down our south coast, across our southern coastline up to a similar latitude in Western Australia, and then all around the island of Tasmania, which is where I'm based. And it's a real biodiversity and endemism hotspot, and that's on the global scale. And by endemism, I just mean uniqueness. So depending on the taxa or the group of organisms you're looking at, whether or not that's fish or red seaweed or shrimp, 30 to 80% of those species are found nowhere else in the world. They are globally unique to the Great Southern Reef and to Southern Australia. So not only is the Great Southern Reef really important to Australians and people that live, very close to this reef system, but it's globally important. And we have a global responsibility, I guess, to look after this system because of its global uniqueness. But it's not only very environmentally important, it's also incredibly economically important, and it directly generates over 11 billion Australian dollars, which a conversion, probably about 7.5 billion US dollars every year to the Australian economy. And I've emphasized directly there because that's stuff in terms of fisheries production, coastal tourism, like scuba diving or whale watching. But we really don't know about a lot of those indirect benefits. So those ecosystem services that the Great Southern Reef provides us, such as protecting our coastlines, cleaning up our waterways, controlling nutrient cycling and in our coastal waterways. So yeah, it's massively undervalued and underestimated, and that $11 billion is definitely an underestimation of the true value of the reef. And I guess that's a real common theme across the Great Southern Reef, is just how undervalued and understudied and underfunded the system is, especially relative to the Great Barrier Reef. Relative to the Great Barrier Reef, we receive anywhere from 1 to 0.1% of the research funding that they receive. So definitely in many ways, the Great Southern Reef is kind of the poorer cousin in terms of the economics potentially, or at least the research funding, but in terms of biodiversity and richness, it really is a very spectacular environment, and certainly on par with the Great Barrier Reef. And yeah, it's incredibly photogenic, incredibly beautiful environment filled with weird and wacky creatures, and pretty much everything on this slide here is found nowhere else in the world, Southern Australia. And I'm a big fan of kind of cryptic diversity. I'm an ecologist. I see value in the small amphipods and the worms and stuff that live under rocks, but I'm not necessarily talking about that cryptic biodiversity when I talk about the spectacular biodiversity on the Great Southern Reef. It's really that kind of macro charismatic biodiversity. So in the top left corner there, you've got the giant Australian cuttlefish, the largest cuttlefish in the world, can grow to over 3 foot long. It's effectively kind of like a swimming trash can, can change the color and the texture of its skin instantaneously, pretty much. Forms these breeding aggregations of tens of thousands of individuals, big kind of cuttlefish orgies. Incredibly amazing creature, incredibly intelligent. Found only in Southern Australia, nowhere else in the world. Got a whole bunch of unique fish species, really charismatic weedy sea dragons, which, just like the seahorses, the male actually has a lot of the parental care. You can see this is a male carrying the eggs, which have been laid on his modified tail by the female, and he'll actually carry them for several weeks, and then he'll kind of give kind of like pseudo birth to them. We've also got creatures like our rock lobster, pretty much the most valuable, or one of the most valuable fisheries in Australia, found only on the Great Southern Reef, found only in the kelp forests of the Great Southern Reef. And that's really the secret of the Great Southern Reef. Like I said, obviously I'm a little bit biased, I'm a kelp forest ecologist, but that really is the foundation of all of that biodiversity and productivity on the Great Southern Reef. And kelp forests in general are these hugely productive and biodiverse ecosystems. Kelp, interestingly enough, doesn't actually have a taxonomic definition. It's a bit like saying a pine tree or an acacia or a retriever, if you're thinking about dog breeds. There is no formal definition to that. It's kind of more of a descriptive term. And for kelp, that really describes those big brown habitat-forming seaweeds. And they occur around the world in temperate, so cold water environments, but even in subpolar, really pretty cool environments. And with climate change, we're actually starting to see them encroach into polar regions as well, especially in the Arctic and the Northern Hemisphere. Just like trees on forest, the ecosystem, and just like trees on land, kelp are ecosystem engineers. You can't have a kelp forest without kelp. So not only do they provide that physical structure, the same way trees do on land, but they're also the energetic foundation, the trophic foundation for these ecosystems, in that organisms eat the kelp. They provide a lot of productivity and a lot of energy to that environment, and they're a really important part in the food chain in our coastal waters. And again, like I said, I mean, seaweed really is the key for the Great Southern Reef. And not many people know, but the Great Southern Reef is effectively like the Amazon, but for seaweed. We have more seaweed diversity here in Southern Australia on the Great Southern Reef than anywhere else in the world, and really, really high levels of endemism as well. Talking about red algae, red seaweed, for example, one of the three main groups of seaweed, 80% of the hyperdiversity of red seaweed we find on the Great Southern Reef occurs nowhere else in the world, Southern Australia, and that's it. But, massively understudied, massively underfunded, and we really have, I guess, got a good research handle and have devoted some research attention to probably literally one or two of the species of the 1,100, 1,200 species that are currently described on the Great Southern Reef. So, I mean, it's no exaggeration. I often tell my students that we could literally go for a dive out kind of near the office or slightly down the coast, and you could easily find and describe a new species of seaweed. So it's a real kind of biodiversity hotspot. And I guess I really like that analogy with the Amazon as well, because not only is it that hyperdiversity and hyperproductivity, but it's also that unknownness and that mystery. And, there's a lot of work at the moment looking at bioprospecting, where people are going out kind of sampling and collecting a lot of that hyperdiversity on the Great Southern Reef and seeing what novel compounds potentially are in those seaweeds. And, a good example of that, I guess, that's received quite a lot of attention recently is Asparagopsis. So this red seaweed, relatively nondescript. They found that there's some certain compounds in there that when you feed them to ruminant livestock, so cows and sheep, it can potentially really massively reduce their methane emissions, which is a really significant greenhouse gas emission from industrial agriculture. So that's that type of kind of unknownness and that mystery and that potential, I guess, that's held on the Great Southern Reef. But like I said earlier, I think I've repeated some of this already. These systems aren't just environmentally important, they also provide a lot of services to humankind. Like I said, they're the foundation of these really important coastal food webs and our fisheries, which in Australia are really, really important parts of our economy, especially in a lot of our regional and rural areas on the coast. We are really a coastal nation, despite the fact that we are such a large continental landmass. A vast majority, I think it's about 85% of our population lives within, 50 miles of the coast. So, we are really an island nation. Our island just happens to be very, very large. Water quality and nutrient cycling, really important part, probably the most important ecosystem services that these forests provide to us. Coastal defense and protection in some places, certainly. It's interesting to know, I guess, how that might kind of interact with projected sea level rises with climate change, and carbon sequestration. Kelp forest in general and blue carbon, I guess more generally, is getting a lot of attention at the moment. I think in many ways the hype is ahead of the science, and the science isn't really there to support a lot of the claims that are being made at the moment. It's certainly far more complex than many people give it credit for, but it is far likely to be a lot more limited, I guess, and spatially variable than a lot of people, I guess, are kind of considering at the moment and claiming. But that's something we can talk a little bit more about later if we have the time. Unfortunately, like many marine environments around the world, in North America, in Europe, and just like the Great Barrier Reef as well, the Great Southern Reef and the kelp forests of the Great Southern Reef are also under threat from a range of anthropogenic stresses. So in some places in Australia, such as Sydney, urbanisation and pollution has been a really big driver of kelp forest loss. That sediment, that disturbance of these environments. We're seeing changing oceanography due to climate change, both in Southwest and Southeast Australia, and both of those regions are actually global ocean warming hotspots. Southeast Australia, for example, there's my cursor, this region here is warming about 3 to 4 times faster than the global average. So even though I'm talking to you here from Wednesday, into the future, in many ways, what's happening, we are actually a window into the future, because we are experiencing changes and climate change in a way that many other places will be experiencing in the next few decades. So which is quite interesting, because there is a lot of attention on our work, but also Tasmania and Southeast Australia more generally, to how we respond to this really massive challenge of climate change. That changing oceanography has direct effects on our environment, such as increasing water temperatures and decreasing coastal nutrients. Part of the reason, the dominant reason that Southeast Australia is an ocean warming hotspot is we've got the East Australian current. You might be familiar with it from Finding Nemo. It's the current that the turtles surf on. It's a warm, nutrient-poor current, comes down from the tropics. It's actually increasing in strength with climate change, and it's bringing that warm, nutrient-poor water further south into places like Tasmania, where our water historically was more characteristic of the Southern Ocean. So, subpolar, really cool, really nutrient rich. And that increased warming and the reduction in coastal nutrients is a really bad combination for a lot of our kelp species here. Not only are we seeing those indirect effects of the East Australian current, but and the water that it brings to our region, but it also has hitchhikers on it. And one of those is a sea urchin, which is native to the mainland of Australia, which has moved into Tasmania, and it's really proliferated now. And a lot of our reef systems have transformed from really lush underwater kelp forests to these urchin barrens, which many of you from California and North America will be familiar with. But they're literally like the surface of the moon. And unfortunately, the way that the urchin dynamics work, they don't really eat themselves. They don't have that boom and bust cycle that many organisms do, like kangaroo or like deer. Once the population booms, they kind of swap feeding mode, and they can persist on really, really small amounts of food and really, really low quality food. And that means that urchin barren and that population of urchins, stays really stable, which is a real big problem for our kelp forests. We're also seeing marine heat waves, which again are these short-term, quite intense warming events, which overlaid with our background warming here can be really significant, obviously, and range-extending herbivores, like I mentioned. Those hitchhikers, not only on the East Australian current, but those gradual kind of, for us, poleward, southward moving species that are moving further south as our waters warm. And this is just an illustration of the behavior of the East Australian current. So it's actually not like a big conveyor belt of water. It's not really like a current that many people consider. About halfway down the coast of New South Wales, so in the lower kind of quarter of the continent, it actually diverges east towards New Zealand. But at that point of divergence, it starts to throw off these really big eddies, which are effectively kind of oceanographic scale whirlpools. They can be hundreds of meters deep, hundreds of kilometers across, and they bring these pockets of warm water and a whole bunch of those hitchhikers further south into Tasmania. And you can see they're, very dynamic environments. And the EAC is one of the strongest and most dynamic currents in the world. So the Southern Australia, but Tassie especially, has some really spectacular kelp forests. And a species that many of you will be familiar with, I'm sure, is giant kelp, Macrocystis porifera. And Tassie really is, or maybe was, the heartland for the species in Australia. It does occur to a lesser extent in very small parts of the mainland, where there are some small upwelling systems. But generally speaking, Tassie is really the only place in Australia, or like I said, it's the heartland for the species. Many of you will be familiar with these forests, but they're really more like underwater jungles than forests, I guess, more reminiscent of lianas and vines, with the way that they kind of stretch up to the surface and form these often impenetrable walls. I remember when I first moved to Tasmania about a decade ago, there were still places that the giant kelp was so thick you couldn't swim through it. Unfortunately, since about the 1970s, we've experienced about 95% reductions in our giant kelp forest cover in Tasmania, and that's directly associated with that activity of the East Australian current and the warming waters, and also reductions in those coastal nutrients. And that's what a lot of these environments look like. We see a lot of these losses really punctuated or amplified over our summer, which is obviously when the water temperatures still get really hot. There's some really interesting ecological interactions that happen. When we lose the giant kelp, it gets replaced by another species called a clonia, or the golden kelp. It always naturally occurred in Tasmania as well, alongside the giant kelp, but now we're seeing a shifting in this dominance hierarchy. And the giant kelp, when they get lost over summer, the golden kelp that are far more temperature tolerant, they kind of move in and fill that space. And a lot of the work we're doing at the moment seems to suggest that the giant kelp then struggles to get back into that environment, even as the kind of autumn or fall and winter water temperatures start to drop. and are back to kind of being suitable for giant kelp, they really struggle to get a foothold back into that environment. So it's a really interesting system. A colony of kelp forest is still incredibly important, incredibly diverse, productive environments, but you've undoubtedly lost something special when you're 30-meter tall, your 90-foot tall giant kelp forest has been replaced with your 3-foot tall Aclonia forest. It's kind of like converting a woodland or a forest on land into a meadow or an area dominated by shrubs. So a lot of the work I'm doing at the moment is looking at restoration and using our ecological knowledge, which is certainly my kind of academic background, kelp forest ecology, using that knowledge to see if we can intervene and actively manage these environments, whether or not we can actually use habitat restoration as a tool to halt some of these losses and potentially, hopefully, even reverse some of these losses and get some of this giant kelp back. A really important kind of tenet for any habitat restoration, however, whether or not that's on land or in the ocean, is you have to overcome or address that initial driver of decline. So you can imagine if you were planting seedlings in a forest on land, if that forest is being logged, that's the driver of decline. Obviously, there's no point planting those seedlings because that stressor is still there. It's the same for kelp forests. Unfortunately, for giant kelp, like I said, that driver of decline is ocean warming, is climate change, and that's not something we can address regionally in the short to medium term, unfortunately. So we've taken a little bit of a reverse approach to it, and we're seeing, rather than changing the environment back to the way it was, is there the potential for us to help the existing kelp kind of be more adapted to these modern conditions that we've created? So what we've gone out and sampled that remaining 5%, which still occurs across the basically across the entire length of Tasmania. So our southern waters, our cooler waters, are where the last big kind of remnant forests exist, but there's still scattered individuals up in our northern areas, which can be 2-3 degrees warmer in winter and in summer. But instead of forming those big forests that they used to, they're just scattered individuals. A bay that used to have a thick surface canopy now literally might only have 1 or 2 individuals, but they still look physiologically healthy. They're still reproductive. They still grow, pretty tall. They just don't form those forests anymore. So we went and sampled from a whole bunch of these remnant populations across eastern Tasmania, which is the real kind of the heartland, I guess, for the species in Tasmania is really eastern Tasmania. We collected spores from them by taking a leaf clipping from this specialized leaf at the base of the kelp called a sporophyll, non-destructive. The giant kelp has hundreds of them. Took them back to the lab. We can release those spores and we can develop these cultures, almost like you've got a yogurt culture or a sourdough or a kombucha culture at home. We can actually do the same for the kelp. And we actually put them in red light, and that kind of, it's a quirk of kelp biology. It basically puts them in a state of hibernation. So they still reproduce vegetatively or clonally, but they just don't mature and develop to the next life stage. So that means we have this culture, this resource that we can sample from while still maintaining our kind of mother cultures. And that's really important experimentally because it means we have material to work with. We don't have to go to the field every time, but it also means we've got traceability. Each of those flasks there are the spores and now the gametophytes, which is one of the microscopic life stages of kelp. They're effectively the juveniles from a single individual. What that means is if we do some of these tests and we identify, potentially are there individuals in the remnant populations that are more tolerant of warm water, we can go back to that flask and we can then sample from it again. We can do different tests on it. We can cultivate it in really large numbers. And they're the kelp at the moment that we're using for our restoration trials. Those individuals that are potentially, to begin with, we had no idea whether or not there were kelp that may be more tolerant of warm water. A lot of that intraspecific, so within the species variation of their thermal tolerance was really unknown. So that was really our first hypothesis, I guess, and our first aim to go out and see if there were some individuals that were warm tolerant. But the culture system allows that traceability for us to kind of go back and identify them. We've also, within about the last kind of 18 months or 2 years, we've set up a seed bank as well. So it's effectively just a repeated version of the primary cultures, but on a smaller scale. And that allows us, I guess it's not only a form of genetic conservation, but it also is just a backup, if a student or more likely one of the high professors leaves the temperature control room door open and all the cultures die, we've got these backups, which is really important. And we've recently moved them to both the secondary and also a tertiary, a third location, again, as a form of backup. So if something catastrophic was to happen to our building, we haven't lost those genotypes and that genetic material, which is really important. So from those kelp that we collected, like I said, we could sample from them, and we grew them in a common garden experiment at a range of different temperatures from 12 to 24 degrees. And 24 degrees is about, I think, about 75 Fahrenheit, which is the maximum that the species really occurs at anywhere in the world. We never reach those temperatures in our environment. We kind of max out at around 20 degrees, but the idea for the 24-degree treatment was it was kind of an experimental endpoint. It was a point where we knew that all the kelp would die. Funnily enough, of all those strains that we tested, we did find some individuals, about 15% of them, that displayed much higher tolerance to warm water, some of which survived even up to that experimental temperature that was meant to kill them, up to 75 Fahrenheit, which was really quite amazing to us, because again, we never reached that in that temperature in the field or in our waters. So there's obviously inherent capacity, physiological capacity of these strains to somehow have, increased tolerance to warm water. Interestingly enough, though, their tolerance wasn't related to the site or the region that we collected them from. So you might assume that the kelp we collected from the northern part of the state, the warmer part of the state for us, would be more tolerant of warm water, and the southern ones vice versa, but that wasn't the case. In fact, some of the most tolerant individuals we found were from our southern, our cooler region, which was very interesting. So at the moment, it kind of just seems like, rather than being a process of adaptation and acclimation that we're seeing in the field, it's really just genetic randomness, just genetic variation that we're seeing across the population that is behind the increased thermal tolerance. So we went back to our cultures. Like I said, we identified those individuals that were more tolerant, and we bred them up in really large numbers, and we planted them at 3 sites initially for restoration trials. These sites are about 30 feet by 30 feet, 10 by 10 meters, or about 100 square meters. So relatively small, but I think that's an important part of it. Laying a foundation of practice and knowledge, I guess, before we get too big. One of the sites fell over immediately. It was always the most difficult site. It's in a very protected embayment. It's almost an estuarine kind of harboury environment. There are a lot of human activities nearby, and the site was just smothered by sediment. And sediment's really kind of public enemy number 1 for juvenile kelp. And that's the important point, I guess, because when we plant these kelp, I often speak to family members and my grandma and stuff, and she thinks I'm going out planting 10-meter tall kelp. We plant the kelp when they're still very, very small juveniles, so only about 2 to 3 mil in size. And you can see here, this is an example of them. This is a small plastic plate that we've seeded in the lab with our super kelp. It's what we kind of jokingly call them. We borrowed that from our tropical colleagues working on super coral. And then we attach them to the bottom, and that's the substrate from which the kelp grow. So like I said, one of the sites fell over straight away, but the other 2 sites have persisted now for 2 years. These were planted in our spring of 2020, so October 2020, pretty much 2 years ago exactly. And they had really kind of good growth rates really quickly. They reached at one of the sites 6 meters within 12 months, and at the other site 12 meters within 12 months. So a meter a month growth rate, which is really pretty spectacular. That size has now reduced a little bit, partly because of our warm summer temperatures, which I'll talk a little bit about at the moment. But at both of these sites, we have about 30 survivors, and the average size is about 2 meters tall. And really, I guess, exciting for us and interesting for us, and kind of a signpost to the next stage of our research, is that the planted kelp are now reproductive. And that's really important, because any restoration efforts, but especially kelp restoration, which can be quite resource intensive, isn't about, me and my colleagues or local communities going and planting individual kelp. What you're actually trying to do is to kickstart the natural cycle. So you want to intervene and plant, generation 1, but the hope is that that generation then naturally propagates and reproduces to form generation 2 and 3 and so on. And so it's quite exciting that we started to see our individuals be reproductive, with the hope that these patches can now become not only self-sustaining, but self-expanding. They can act as these little seed patches. So I mentioned that we've seen kind of reductions in our growth rates and our size of our kelp. So I said when we lose the giant kelp naturally in Tasmania, so the summer, our kelp, despite the fact that they are more tolerant of warm water, they still certainly suffer over summer. They just don't completely die off, unlike the natural kelp that effectively just melt away. And so they're starting from scratch every year. Whereas our kelp, they kind of die back quite a lot, but they still have a lot of healthy tissue left. And then the idea is once our fall and winter and spring water temperatures come along that are a lot lower, it's also the time where there's slightly more nutrients in the water for us naturally, that they've got a head start and they bolt back up again. Interestingly, this year we haven't seen that as much. The recovery after summer, which obviously for us was 9 months ago now, really 8 months ago, has been very, very slow. So we've been really monitoring them quite closely over our winter and spring right now. And the hope is that we start to see some accelerated growth rates leading up to Christmas. And that'll again give them that kind of resilience to handle what will be another stressful summer for them. We've had 3 La Nina summers in a row, which for us are slightly above average. That represents water temperatures that are slightly above average for us, a La Nina year. So the fact that we've got any survivorship at all is really encouraging, but it's certainly not like we've solved this problem and these kelp are going to go and grow in the tropics now or even the subtropics. And that's a really important part of our work. And I'll talk about it a little bit later on, I guess, in that, what we're doing is we're really kind of transparent and honest about we're buying time. This exercise of selecting for these individual genotypes that are more tolerant isn't going to solve climate change. It isn't going to mean that we can have giant kelp in the future if we don't get a handle on our emissions. Reducing our emissions and getting a handle on climate change right now is still the #1 priority. But these are some of the photos from our patches when they were kind of at their peak, which was just before last Christmas. And it's pretty incredible to see, having planted them at 2 millimeters small, to go back and then see an individual kelp, which is so thick, there's so many stipes, I could barely wrap my hand around it. Some of the individuals that are 12 meters tall, pretty much at the surface. There's little areas of these patches that are starting to look like little areas of giant kelp forest, which is really encouraging to see. A lot of the work we're doing is not only related to that ecology and biology, but something that I'm personally very interested in and getting more involved in from a research point of view is, I guess, the ethics and the community and the people side of restoration, right? I mean, conservation and restoration are inherently human-centric activities. And I guess when we're intervening in these environments the way we are, where we're transplanting kelp or genotypes or genetic material from one place to another, that does throw up some pretty complex ethical issues and questions. And I've certainly been approached by members of the community who are a little bit uncomfy by what we're doing, and I am totally on board with it. I think that a default reaction of being uncomfy to what we're doing is probably better than a default reaction of being just totally okay with what we're doing. But I guess a really cool part of that is, we are considering that, and we've really got kind of strong community support with what we're doing. And a lot of the, I guess, the radicalness, the extremeness of our intervention is matched by how dire our situation is. In many places in Australia, they haven't experienced 95% losses in their giant kelp or whatever species of kelp they happen to have there. And therefore, this response would probably be a little bit kind of disproportionate at the moment. And they're not considering transplanting specific genotypes. They've got other kind of tricks up their sleeve. Whereas here in Tasmania, we really are losing kelp still very rapidly. I mean, that 95% loss is still happening. Like I said, every year we are losing forests. We have field sites that are sometimes football field size kelp forests just before last Christmas. And we went back January this year and they are gone. They've literally just melted away. So these losses are still continuing, and that's really a large part of, I guess it's a large component of the risk assessment and I guess the decision making behind what we're doing. But of course, I mean, we've really massively stressed ourselves over these issues. And, I probably think no one has really considered and worried and stressed over these decisions more than me. I mean, it's no exaggeration to say there've been sleepless nights about what we're doing. But a lot of our activity, or all of our activity, is really informed by the best available science that we have and by the best evidence that we have. So a lot of that work was around Tasmanian giant kelp genetics. So a lot of the early genetics work, in fact, the only genetics work that has up until recently been done on giant kelp, suggested that there's really high population connectivity in Tasmania. So that gave us confidence that we could potentially be, that it was okay to be relocating genotypes or individuals from the northern part of our state to the southern part of our state where our restoration efforts are, because naturally those populations are really connected. Of course, we don't just wash our hands with that, I guess, and say, okay, job's done on that aspect of the study. We're going and refining that now and actually using some more modern, some more high resolution genetic methods. We found that there actually is a little bit of difference between the northern and the southern populations, and they do kind of break into two regions. And that's really important, valuable information, and that immediately gets fed into our decision-making process. And as a team, we decided straight away that we no longer translocate any northern genotypes to the south or vice versa, any southern genotypes to the north, even if they're warm tolerant, it doesn't matter. Another really important part of our decision-making trials, and again, it kind of leans on that the severity of the losses that we've had, is that at the 3 trial sites where we planted giant kelp, there were no giant kelp left. So there wasn't really an issue in terms of genetic pollution or our planting efforts interfering with or impacting the natural giant kelp that was still hanging on at those sites. I've got a little asterisk there because at one of the sites, actually, the week we were there planting, the first few giant kelp popped up at that site that we'd seen in 3 or 4 years. It's a site that I dive probably monthly and have dived monthly for the last 5 or 6 years. And there was a really long gap, like I said, where we didn't see any giant kelp. And all of a sudden, this little patch, probably only the size of a car or a dining room table, popped up out of nowhere. And I guess that's, again, quite exciting for us, and it's really indicative of how much or how little we know, not only for kelp that we study quite intensively and these sites that we study quite intensively, but across the Great Southern Reef. To have these 10-metre tall giant kelp pop up out of nowhere was pretty astounding. We're certainly only at the trial stages. People say, are you walking before we're running? I'd say we're at the crawling stages still. We're not even walking yet. Everything we do is in really close collaboration with our regulators. That's one benefit of working in Tasmania. We're quite a small state. A colleague from North America the other day actually kind of compared us to the Alaska of the USA. So, we're a little bit, our population's a lot smaller. We're a lot more linked to our natural environment. A lot of our regulators are very receptive, and, we can pick up the phone, or I can walk 100 meters that way to the regulator's office. And if they have any concerns about what we're doing, we can, or any questions, we can answer those questions. So that's a really important part of it. And I guess that's a bigger theme about the work we're doing, is it's very collaborative. And, we've got a whole bunch of community feedback, like I said, and generally speaking, individuals are okay with what we're doing, with the type of transplanting and the interventions we're doing. And even those people that are a little bit uneasy to begin with, which again, I think is totally fair and acceptable. Once you kind of sit down and describe to them basically what I've described to you here, it kind of allays some of those concerns, and they do pretty much without fail, they get on board. They're very supportive of what we're doing. Like I kind of touched on earlier, this certainly isn't a silver bullet solution, and frankly, there is no silver bullet solution. I can't really think of a silver bullet solution for anything, let alone climate change and kelp restoration in a climate change hotspot. And I kind of like to describe it as a toolbox approach. So if you're fixing a car or building a house, you don't just use one tool, you have to use all the tools at your disposal. And that's really the same for giant kelp restoration, or for kelp restoration in general. So, these selection for specific genotypes that might be more tolerant, that's one part of it, but we also need to get a handle on those urchins, like I mentioned, and I'll chat a little bit about in the next 5 minutes. And also, get a handle on our carbon emissions and our greenhouse gas emissions, of course. And that really is all that we're doing. We're just buying time for those emission reductions. So I think this is my last slide. I'll just kind of touch through it. So we've got kind of plenty of time for discussions and questions, but there's a whole bunch of work we're still doing. This is really just a small part of it. So obviously we're monitoring the existing patches that we've planted to see whether or not there is natural recruitment, whether or not those patches are self-expanding and self-supporting. We're just about to move to our next phase of restoration trials. We'll be moving to kind of almost the hectare scale, and that will happen within the next 2 or 3 weeks. We're planting those kelp. We're always refining and improving our planting methods. I mean, the methods that we use for those first experimental trials, they weren't intended ever to be scalable. They're too kind of resource intensive, and you don't really want to be putting bolts and plastic plates throughout the coast of Tasmania. So we're looking now at methods that are more scalable. We're doing a lot of physiology at the moment. We've just wrapped up a really interesting project that's effectively trying to find out what makes our super kelp super. So our common garden experiments clearly showed that some of the individuals are far more tolerant, but what we're really interested in now is unpicking some of that, trying to understand what mechanism actually makes them more tolerant. And again, the reality is that it's not just one single mechanism. It seems to be kind of a suite of things, and some of the genotypes are slightly different in some respects, whereas other warm tolerant genotypes are different in other respects. So again, that toolbox approach, right? Even for the kelp, there is no one thing that makes them super. It's a suite of different things. We've got a breeding program up and running, so that'll be looking at kind of the next generation. And at the moment, we're just harnessing that natural variation, right? We're just looking for those natural giant kelp individuals from the field that are more tolerant of warm water. We're now moving to a breeding program. The decision is still yet to be made whether or not those individuals get outplanted, but that's something that's ongoing, and discussions again with the community and with regulators. A whole bunch of kelp forest ecology and site suitability stuff. Obviously, one of the best ways to restore kelp forest is to understand the way the natural systems work. A large part of that kelp forest ecology we're doing at the moment is understanding the urchin problem. And urchin control really has to happen at the same time as any of our planting efforts. At our experimental sites, we clear all the urchins, but more broadly speaking for Tasmania, there's a urchin fishery happening at the moment. They've been taking about 400 or 500 tonne a year for the last few years, and that's really exciting. But it seems to be in many places the fishery is not quite enough due to some of the intricacies in the way that they harvest. They're potentially not taking enough from a given area. So we're looking at the moment whether or not we can tag on some culling, potentially some community-led culling efforts that can kind of follow the commercial divers and help to clear up some of that remaining urchins and start to get some of the kelp coming back naturally. We're also doing a lot of mapping and surveying work. We've just, within about 18 months ago, we released a citizen science app called Kelp Tracker, and we're just about to update that to Kelp Tracker 2.0, where individuals can go out, any waterway users, fishers, kayakers, walkers on the beach, whatever. If they see canopies of giant kelp, they can log them, they can take a photo, they can just give us a bit of a description about the canopy. Is it healthy? Is it big? Etc. And that really helps us to kind of identify these areas, because we've literally lost so much of it. Sometimes it can be physically hard to go out and find a patch to study. Awesome. So yeah, that's, like I said, there's definitely a really big team, both within Tasmania, within Australia, and also internationally. I've worked a lot with the Nature Conservancy's office out of California. I have some very close collaborations there, and they're really leading kelp forest restoration, I guess, research and practice a lot, really globally, and a lot of colleagues from California. So yeah, again, thank you very much for the invite, and it was a real pleasure to chat to you all. And yeah, more than happy to have a bit of a group discussion and answer any questions I can.